Well, good evening everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all and to the Advocates Library, where it's both, I think, pertinent and an utter delight that we gather where Scots shadow still lingers in the legal heart of the city. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this joint lecture between the Edinburgh Saltwater Scot Club and the University of Edinburgh Department of English Literature, acknowledging at the very outset here, with many thanks, the preparation that has gone in by all involved to bringing this event to life. Which actually brings us perfectly on to the very first item of this evening's agenda, and a very exciting part of this evening. So this is the award of the Scottish Literary Studies Medal. And so to do this, I would like to hand over to Professor Pennyfield.
Would you like to come up? So the winner of this year's medal, Cara Blacklock. Cara graduated this year with a first-class degree in English literature, and she won the prize for her final essay in the course, The Novel in the Romantic Period. That essay scored 82, which is a very, very high mark. Technically it's out of 100, but in fact nobody ever gets more than 80 for some reason, apart from Cara. So there we go. The focus of the essay was the intersection of fiction and history in Guy Mannering and James Hogg's Three Perils of Woman. And Cara argued that Hogg and Scott conceptualise history in different ways. So Scott presents history as a linear progression of the times and characters of Scotland. So his narrative gets rid of anything other to that linear progression. Whereas Hogg relishes the interruptions and sort of supernatural figures in Scottish literature. And he sees the past as Gothic and uncanny, when past and present meld with each other. Cara is also interested in other aspects of Scottish literature. She loves the work of Margaret Oliphant, quite right, me too. Both Oliphant's Gothic stories and her novel Hester. And Cara has a particular interest in the Gothic, and she wrote a dissertation on Gothic doubles, so drawing on Stevenson, Jekyll and Hyde, Master Ballantrae. And her favourite Scott novel is Ivanhoe, but her absolutely favourite text in Scottish literature is George Douglas Brand's The House of the Green Shutters. And we're very pleased that Cara is hoping to return to the Department of English to read for a postgraduate degree in English literature. So please join me in congratulating Cara, who is this year's winner of the Walter Scott Club Medal.
Many congratulations to Cara on a really magnificent achievement. And so on to this evening's lecture, and I'd like to welcome our speaker, Professor Susan Oliver. Susan Oliver is Faculty Dean Research at the University of Essex and has written extensively on 18th century and Romantic period literature, with an especial focus on eco-criticism and environmental writing. In this latter interest, Scott has been a major figure in Susan's research, and indeed was the focus of her 2021 publication with Cambridge University Press, Walter Scott and the Greening of Scotland, Emergent Ecologies of a Nation. This is both the title and topic of Susan's lecture for us this evening, where Susan will lead us on an exploration of Scott's rich intertwining of writing and place, from his imaginative engagement with landscape and lore to his very real interest and involvement in the natural environment. And so, ladies and gentlemen, everybody present, I'd invite you to join with me in welcoming Susan Oliver.
And thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm deeply honoured to be here this evening giving the annual Walter Scott lecture. And I'd like to say a special thank you to Peter Garside, who I believe nominated me for this lecture, and for Penny, for also, I believe, nominating me. A big thank you too to Lee and Michael for their arrangements in enabling me to come here this evening, and thank you to everybody for coming along to hear what I have to say. I gave a lecture to the club in 2016. It doesn't seem 5 minutes ago, but it's now a little while in the past, and I'm going to talk about something different tonight, but I very much hope that what I have to say, which is based on my book, will interest you. So, on with the lecture. Walter Scott and the Greening of Scotland, Emergent Ecologies of a Nation. My lecture is based on my book, and my aim in writing that book was to reread Scott. Sorry, I just need to find what I've done with the remote control. Sorry. Oh, here. Thank you. Apologies for that. My aim in writing the book was to reread Scott, one of the most globally influential, if not the most influential and popular writers of the 19th century, in order to uncover something that I knew was there from the very first time that I started reading him. I wanted to know and write about the full extent of Scott's interest in and contribution to environmental literature and ecological historiography. Now, since he was educated in the Edinburgh of the Scottish Enlightenment, it's to be expected that Scott would have explored the way that societies evolved, the relationships between people, their communities, and their development. Yet natural science was also an important area of Scottish Enlightenment inquiry and one of its most significant intellectual and literary exports. Georg Lukács, the historical novel, one of the most enduring and pioneering studies of the socio-historical focus of Scott's work, still has plenty of relevance today. And since Lukács, the expansive volume of critical inquiry into Scott's groundbreaking representations of people and the events that shaped their lives has brought a variety of theoretical and critical perspectives to bear on Scott's studies. What I've tried to do with this book is to foreground his equivalent contribution to the memory mapping of the non-human world. Green zones emerge in Scott's writing, attending to several centuries of changes in land use, ranging from the drainage of marshes in the debatable lands to the increase in monocultural pasturage for sheep farming, from deforestation and reforestation, using native rather than imported species, to the effects on the land of depopulation through mass migration, effectively, as I believe I said in my last lecture, an exchange with Canada of people for trees, and from the storytelling that depends on the shifting riparian environments to the folklore of mountains, islands, lakes, and seashores. The move from Enlightenment science to Romantic writing, with its emphasis on feeling as a means to knowledge, provided a perfect literary environment for Scott to write about environmental change and its impact. And write about it he did over almost 4 decades, from 1795 to 1832, and across genres of poetry in translation, ballad collections, original short and long poetry, verse drama, prose fiction, literary journalism, letters, and personal record keeping. I'm sure, like me, you're always astonished at the sheer range of Scott's writing, that he was so much more than the poet and the novelist that many people remember him as being. And in so doing, he left us with one of the 19th century's most significant critical inquiries into a nation's environmental history. And Scott was very critical about the way that environmental history had developed through land change. Everyday people in Scott's novels comment on the effects of a decline in the number of salmon in Scotland's rivers due to overnetting in the estuaries. Fictional fisherwomen haggle over the pricing of common and rarer species of fish, herring, John Dory, turbot. People lose their livelihoods, some lose their lives. Modern breeds of cattle are compared with extinct species, whose larger bones have been found preserved in peat marshes. Descriptions in Scott's novels even formed the basis for the breed standards for some types of working dog. Fruit trees and pasture for livestock are watered by streams that flow through sites of massacre, transferring minerals and organic compounds along the food chain, even hinting at vicarious cannibalism and vampirism, and I refer here to old mortality. At a less gruesome but environmentally nevertheless worrying level, wildflowers tenuously cling to existence at the edge of trails near to the spot where, according to legend, the 14th century Scottish poet Thomas of Erceldoune, known as the Rhymer, was taken on his journey of subterranean discovery by an elf woman. In Scott's novels, stones accumulate deer hair, lichens, particles of soil that permeate their surface and reveal a still unfolding history beyond the human lives that may or may not be memorialised in inscriptions on them. The unchanging solidity of rock is brought into question by that organic process of slow but constant transformation. These stories of environments and their agency were told, retold and elaborated on by Scott. If I were to look at all those areas of his writing, we would be here for hours longer than we have this evening. So the rest of my lecture will focus on two main areas from my book. First, I'm going to talk about trees, and then about islands and seas as they are represented in Scott's 1821 novel, The Pirate. In my conclusion, I will briefly touch on some other aspects of the book, so to trees. The planting and cultivation of trees always seemed to me the most interesting occupation of the country. Planting and pruning trees I could work at from morning till night, and if my own poetical revenues enabled me to have a few acres of my own, that is one of the principal pleasures that I look forward to. Scott, letter to Joanna Bailey, dated the 23rd of November, 1810. Scott wrote those words a year before he bought the property that would become Abbotsford, where he would most fully exercise his passion for planting trees. But as an author, he had already explored, from his 1790s translations of German poetry onwards, connections between people and the woodlands, forests, and individual trees with which they lived. His version of Goethe's The Erl King, written in 1797, focuses on the relationship between trees and the occult imagination. A father and son ride, quote, by night through the woodland so wild. The father in vain tried to convince the child that the low-pitched whispering the boy hears is nothing but the wild blast as it sung through the trees. Let's think about that for a moment. The disjunction between the sound the father responds to, a wild blast, and the hushed whisper that the boy hears draws attention to how they actually hear quite different sounds from the forest around them. While the Black Forest informed Germany's folklore and literary imagination, Scott would soon argue for the centrality of trees to Scottish literature, as well as to his nation's character and to its ecology. As I mentioned in my last lecture for the Edinburgh Walter Scott Club in 2016, his version of Thomas the Rhymer for Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border entwines the very roots of Scottish poetry with those of the legendary Eildon tree that grew on Huntly Bank near Melrose. In that hybrid version of an old ballad with Scott's own modern editions, the Eildon tree, probably a hawthorn, becomes the point of origin and departure for Scottish literature. 16 years later, The Heart of Midlothian is as arguably concerned with the environment as with its main moral and legal storyline. The practical advice of the Laird of Dumbydykes to his son is, and I'm not going to try to do a Scottish accent here because I will offend people, when you have nothing else to do, you may be eye-sticking in a tree. It will be growing jock when you're sleeping. Scott reused those very same words in October 1827 in the closing sentence of his anonymously published review of Robert Monteith's The Forester's Guide and Profitable Planter, and Scott was writing for the Quarterly Review. It presented the words as the economic and environmental wisdom of a dying landowner passed on for the benefit of subsequent generations. Scott argued in that essay, an important example of his journalism, that a thriving forestry industry in Scotland would provide good jobs that could stem the tide of migration towards similar work in Canada. The woods, requiring in succession planting, pruning, thinning, felling and barking, would furnish to the labourers a constant source of employment. They would be naturally attached to the soil on which they dwelt. To return to the heart of Midlothian, for Dunby Dykes, trees represent economic opportunity as much as stewardship of the land, although Scott's note in the Magnum Opus edition takes a more cultural and aesthetic view, in which a restoration of woodland would also improve the character of the countryside. Quote, "The author has been flattered by the assurance that this naive mode of recommending arboriculture had so much weight with a Scottish earl as to lead to his planting a large tract of country." Let's return to Scott the journalist and pamphleteer for a moment. Metaphors of ecology and forestry also underpin the arguments through which he ensured Scotland's retention of its banknotes and independent legal system, showing how trees shaped his imagination when he was thinking about the nationhood and its character. Green Scotland is pressed into the service of the economy, but perhaps not in the expected way. In three letters that he wrote in the fictional persona of Malachi Malagratha on the proposed change of currency, which were published in the Edinburgh Weekly Journal and as pamphlets in 1826, the economy and legislature are represented as interconnected ecosystems. In the first letter, arguing for the retention of Scottish banknotes, the Bank of England is compared with an English oak tree, the branches and roots of which have spread only as far as where England borders with Scotland, while its custodians in London insist that it be given sole rights further northwards to the soil, the water and the air. Malagratha complains of the damage that Scotland would suffer from being forced fully to adopt English currency. We have no benefit from that immense establishment, which, like a great oak, overshadows England from Tweed to Cornwall. Why should our national plantations be cut down or cramped for the sake of what affords us neither shade nor shelter, and which besides can take no advantage by the injury done to us? He then uses an analogy in which other tree species symbolically stand in for banknotes, differentiating between what might successfully be grown in Scotland and in England, referring to the mulberry as a species that grows best in milder climates, and which he knew to be a popular tree in London and England's southern counties. He dismissed the idea that something as fundamental as banknotes and laws can easily be replaced with those that have grown to maturity in different socio-political soils. In transplanting a tree, little attention need be paid to the character of the climate and soil from which it is brought, and greater care must be taken to those of the situation to which it is transplanted, that they are fitted to receive it. It would be no reason for planting mulberry trees in Scotland that they luxuriate in the south of England. Where actual trees are concerned, Scott was most interested in species that had flourished within Scottish ecosystems for millennia, and which were part of the ancient Great Caledonian Forest. His planting journals, Silva Abbotsfordiensis, Letters and Journal, Main Journal, all show that those species predominated in his planting at Abbotsford. It's fair to say that Scott mourned the loss of Scotland's old-growth forest, mentioning it in every form of his writing. Today, remnants of that forest still exist in Grampian and a few parts of the northern and western Highlands, where they are protected as special areas of conservation. Historical chronicles, natural science, stadial history, the beginnings of archaeology, and discoveries made during the bog drainage that I've already mentioned, all mainstays of the Scottish Enlightenment, agricultural revolution and romantic period in which Scott lived, contributed to his understanding of the areas once covered by these ancient forests and of the species that grew in them. Now, modern technologies have enabled the tracing of the interaction between people and the woods. We know, for example, that human habitation occurred in what is now the Scottish borders around 8000 BC, when tree growth was flourishing in the moraine soils that had been left after the retreat of the ice sheets from the last great period of glaciation. In the chapter on my book on rarity and extinction, I discuss how the remains of Scotland's ancient forest provides habitat for rare animals and bird species. I'm sure many people here have been reading recently about the decline in the number of capercaillie, which live in the part of the ancient old-growth woodland in the Cairngorms. So Scott wrote about how the ancient forest provided habitat for rare animal and bird species in his own time and in the past, and how, in his novel, A Legend of the Wars of Montrose, it is also the home to persecuted people who share their legal status with a rare species, wolves, which at the time of the action of the story had already been selected for extinction. I want to say a bit more about tree species and prehistoric pre-national landscapes, because individual tree types so fascinated Scott. Looking back to before human settlement and shortly after that last great period of glaciation, the trees that first grew were mainly birch and hazel, followed by a more varied evergreen and deciduous woodland that included oak, elm, ash, alder, hawthorn and Scots pine. Aspen, juniper and rowan also grew abundantly. Birch and hazel were the dominant species across much of Scotland's pre-national landmass, with Scots pine predominating in parts of what would become the Highlands. By the end of the 5th millennium BC, almost all the tree species that are now regarded as native to Scotland were widely distributed. And I'm drawing here on the work of Gordon Noble. Scott could not have known the timeline of that early development of forestation, but the species just mentioned all figure repeatedly in his writing. Along with Scots pine, birch plays a prominent role in his fiction as a major focus of his planting programme and as an uncanny species in the monastery, where a monk is unsure whether he sees a ghost or a decaying birch tree. Even if he sees a tree, it is effectively a ghost. Scott wrote about the absence of birch trees along the Tweed Valley. They had all gone, and he put in place his own programme to replant them, at least as far as he could. His frequent references to the Ettrick and Caledonian forests in main texts, footnotes and personal writing from the beginning of his literary career until his death show an interest that surely shades into obsession, and we know that plantsmanship, in particular planting trees, contributed to his eventual insolvency. Scott knew from his antiquarian's interest in chronicles that the Ettrick and Caledonian forests had actually mostly been destroyed by the late Middle Ages. Memories of lost areas of woodland recalled in his fiction haunt the high moorland and riparian valleys of the borders, the highlands and their margins, agricultural land, parkland, and the managed commercial woodland of more recent times. He explored how real trees in the material environment had been replaced by those of myth and legend in the cultural imagination after the trees themselves had gone, in a form of environmental mourning. Writing to George Ellis in May 1804, less than a year after the completion of the first edition of the Minstrelsy, he expressed concern about a modern borders ecology that was dominated by grass and sheep at the expense of older mixed woodland and flora that he felt sure would quickly return if only it was given the chance. Long sheep and short sheep and tups and gimmers and hogs and dinmonts had made a perfect sheepfold of my understanding. Scott uses those words in the sense that this kind of farming was hemming in his imagination. We just hardly get cleared of them. Ettrick Forest boasts finely shaped hills and clear romantic streams, but alas, they are bare to wildness and denuded of the beautiful natural wood with which they were formerly shaded. It is mortifying to see that wherever the sheep are excluded, the copses immediately sprung up in abundance, so that enclosures only are wanting to restore the wood wherever it might be useful or ornamental, yet hardly a proprietor has attempted to give it fair play for a resurrection. You can hear the passion in those words. The emphasis here is on use or utility on the one hand, and the ornamental value of trees on the other hand. And of course, since this is Scott, this nostalgia for what has been lost. But I suggested that in this short piece of confessional epistolary writing, Scott shows a remarkable anticipation of what we now call rewilding, and an understanding of fundamental principles of what has become, in the 21st century, restoration conservation. He also endorses an 18th century aesthetic scale of values consistent with artist William Hogarth's analysis of beauty, in which aesthetic beauty must incorporate principles of design and, crucially, an essential fitness for purpose if it is to meet the definition of the beautiful rather than just of the wild. The woods provide practical shade for people and livestock, yet they appear to him as instances of natural beauty. Use and nature work together. Scott's preference for this kind of approach to arboricultural practice and environmental stewardship is easily seen in his planting at and near Abbotsford and in literary records in his notebooks, letters and journals. Those documents testify to his privileging the recreation of an earlier Scottish wooded landscape over the fashion at the time for collecting exotic specimen trees. Of the 19 trees that he named as either existing or being planted on the land that he owned in or after 1819, only 4, larch, sweet chestnut, North American black pine and North American white pine, are not anciently native to Scotland. Larch is an interesting case because Scott recognised it both as an invasive species needing constant thinning and care, and as a valuable introduced tree to Scotland when planted in the right place. And he differed there from William Wordsworth, who in his Guide to the Lakes expressed his loathing for the larch as an alpine tree that was out of place in Britain. Larch came to Scotland in 1738 in the form of several trees gifted by agricultural improver and exiled Jacobite Mingus of Calders to the second Duke of Atholl for the latter's Perthshire estate. Mingus had been exiled to North America after participating in the 1715 Jacobite rebellion. The gifted larches therefore represent a transatlantic ecological connection forged between Scotland and what would later in that century become the United States. In turn, the Duke of Atholl experimented with these trees by using them as the main species in his creation of Scotland's first mountain tree plantation at Craigvinian Hill, Perthshire. Subsequent dukes capitalised on the commercial value of growing larch in that soil, which was otherwise very difficult to cultivate, not just for their commercial value as fast-growing softwood, which was the case, but also because of the tourist appeal of what became in the 19th century, and still is, the distinctive Craigvinian forest. Scott wrote excitedly in an 1813 letter to Joanna Bailey that he had been busying himself at Abbotsford, quote, planting and screening and diking against the river and planting willows and aspens and weeping birches. His excitement is so evident. There were also moments of horror, though. A sudden infestation of caterpillars in June 1824 gave rise to an eco-Gothic account of a sight that stopped Scott in his tracks. A green caterpillar, not an aphis, has appeared on these trees in quantity as thick as the leaves which it devours and resembling them both in colour and shape. You see that the tufts are composed of caterpillars instead of leaves. The insect writhes and agitates itself in a very lively manner. Upon the whole, the sight is equally disgusting and discouraging. They eat all the leaves bare, excepting the summer shoot, which they do not seem to touch. The numbers on one tree were something quite frightful, and their powers of destruction seem to rival those of the locust. The plantations above the road are quite alive with them. These were almost certainly the caterpillars of the pine hawk moth, Sphinx pinastri. The leaves that Scott refers to are needles of Scots pine, a tree to which the pine hawk moth, understandably, is particularly partial. There is a happy ending here, though. By August, the caterpillars had pupated, and Scott would later exclaim his delight at the lack of lasting damage to the trees. And I take you back to the point where he notices that they actually don't touch the growing shoot. I want to move on now to a different part of my book, which looks at Scott's interest in weather, sea conditions and island environments. But before I do so, let's just look for a moment at how substantial Scotland's coastline actually is. This map is provided online by the Scottish Government, and it charts Scotland's territorial waters. Under the Scotland Act 1988, based on fishing rights, the nation's sea territory is nearly 6 times the size of its landmass. Always a maritime nation, and archipelagic in every sense of the word, the nation's sea territory is nearly 6 times the size of its landmass. More than 900 islands and the mainland share a coastline that extends to around 18,743 kilometres. Scott wouldn't and couldn't have known those statistics, but his writing shows just how compelling he found the coastal and marine nation and its environment. And I'd like to say here a big thank you to Anna Pills, who is here this evening, and to Penny Fielding for their organising of the Scotland's Coastal Romanticisms project, which I was honoured to speak at in February, and in which we brought together a number of people who were looking at this, this maritime environment of Scotland. There will be a publication coming out of that group, and we very much look forward to that. It will be available to people to read. As 1821 drew to a close, though, the Pirate took Scott's fiction further northwards to Shetland, and some of its action extended to the open sea. Scott had travelled there during the summer of 1814 at the invitation of the Northern Lighthouse Commissioners, spending 6 weeks of his tour in the islands. And I'll just draw your attention there to the fact that it was the summertime when he went on that tour. As Mark Weinstein and Alison Lumsden have shown, the diary that he kept of the excursion is one of the most important sources for his novel, with its observations on farming and fishing, including whaling, cultural life and social class, architecture, archaeology, history, topography and seascapes. And Penny, I know you've also done a lot of work and written on the Pirate, and thank you for that inspiration. Almost all of the material in the Lighthouse Tour diary was actually reworked and integrated into the fictional narrative of Scott's novel, including the tale of John Gow, an early 18th century pirate from Wick, who was the model for the title character. But I'm interested here in Scott's treatment of environmental conditions and phenomena. Given its location, the Pirate predictably concerns an island community torn between 2 communities, farming and seafaring. The community described by Scott argues of whether there really is a need to improve the subsistence agriculture on which it has depended quite happily for hundreds of years, while simultaneously struggling to meet an increasing demand for its young men to go to sea in the expanding fishing industry. The representation of the sea throughout the Pirate is sublime, with weather, sound and daylight adding to the sense of a dangerous environment. Scott addresses the effect on the mind of the northern seas experienced in subarctic winter daylight, and of the poor visibility brought about by fog as a prelude to an episode of dramatic storytelling. The ocean had its mysteries, the effect of which was aided by the dim winter light through which it was imperfectly seen for more than half the year, Scott's words. In fact, his own visit had taken him closer to an experience of the opposite effect, the simmer dim or midnight sun, when the sky doesn't fully darken at night. After all, he visited Orkney and Shetland in the summer. The Shetland day lasts for just 5 hours 49 minutes on the 21st of December, and there is no emergence from astronomical, nautical or civil twilight. By contrast, on the 21st of June, the longest day, daytime accounts for an astonishing 18 hours and 55 minutes. These extremes on the scale of experience of day and night blur boundaries in ways that encourage imaginative thinking about how we variously perceive the same environment. Scott follows with a conjectured account in which the North Sea is said to have bottomless depths and secret caves where marine monsters, including the kraken, that hugest of living things, just might be found. Banks of fog, a combination of water and air, provide him with plausible meteorological background to reports from sailors who claim to have seen the horns of the monstrous Leviathan whelking and waving midst the wreaths of mist. Sightings of sea snakes with glossy manes are also mentioned in accounts of a creature resembling the later fabled Loch Ness Monster. All this is described by Scott as a mixed ecology of actual and fantastical living things in what was still understood in his lifetime to be a deep-sea marine wilderness, often with biblical underpinning. And I'd just like to sort of say that that bringing together of actual environmental phenomena and actual ecologies with fantastical ecologies is something I think is very unique to Scott and something that he does extremely well. Scott really makes the argument for there being a place in environmental understanding for the creatures of the imagination as well as the living, biologically living creatures that he knows were there. So Scott attributes the existence of these speculative ecologies to Shetland's northern latitude and its maritime environment, its weather and its boreal seasonal light conditions. The imagination is far more powerfully affected on the deep and dangerous seas of the north, amidst precipices and headlands many hundreds of feet in height, amid perilous straits and currents and eddies, long sunken reefs of rock over which the vexed ocean foams and boils. In The Pirate, the character Mordaunt Merton's romantic disposition enables him to treat superstitions involving sea monsters as, quote, a pleasing and interesting exercise of the imagination. But in his note on monsters of the northern seas for the Magnum edition, Scott proposes that reports of sea serpents were probably attributable to natural circumstances, such as Norwegian spruce trunks washed out to sea and seen through fog. He comments on the remains of a mysterious animal that had been washed ashore and sent to London, where Joseph Banks identified it as a basking shark that had drifted northwards. In all these instances, the boundaries between living things and organic elements break down to allow anomalous, metamorphic, shape-shifting forms to emerge. That process encourages readers to think about the biodiverse environment of Scotland's seas in a blend of Enlightenment classification that shifts towards a more disturbing and disruptive later 19th century Darwinian evolutionary process. In other instances in The Pirate, the incoming night tides of calmer inshore waters ripple over shingle and shells on the shoreline, apparently bringing a mermaid who was reported to skim the water's edge of the sand and shell beaches, quote, mingling her voice with the sighing breeze to sing of subterranean wonders. Here once again is an example of the oral sound environment that Scott so effectively captures time and again, bringing to readers through storytelling a sense of natural agency that was ahead of his time. For Scott, the marine grotesque and the wonderful enable the imagination to feed off the reality of environmental conditions and the boom in natural scientific inquiry into the biosystems of the sea. What is old in terms of folklore translates into the very modern in terms of environmental science and understanding. Island settings in The Pirate also emphasise the instability that undermines perceived natural boundaries by which human lives are shaped. How do we see the world around us? Can we rely on what we see? Scott always asks those questions. The Atlantic-facing 450-foot sandstone stack in the Orkney archipelago, known as the Old Man of Hoy, features towards the end of the novel as a place of transformative, shifting appearance. Scott writes that as a landmark, the Old Man of Hoy may or may not be visible from land or sea, since it appears to sink or rise from the water depending on a number of factors: tidal swells, the position of the viewer, weather conditions. It dematerialises entirely when sea mist rolls in from the west. The cries of eagles, fishhawks and other birds, for which it forms a dark, unmolested retreat, those are Scott's words, provide the only continuous evidence of its existence, drawing attention to what Scott understood there and elsewhere in his writing as the sound ecologies that I've just mentioned. And the pirate is full of the cries of eagles and fish and seabirds. Hoy is a liminal environment where even the soil is characterised by Scott as anything but dry land. I refer her to the island itself. Wet, mossy, cold, quote Scott's words, and generally unproductive, it supports a limited range of primitive vegetation that goes right back to the thawing that followed that last great ice age that I mentioned earlier. The growth here comprising, as Scott says, dwarf bushes of birch, hazel and wild currant. A storm episode in The Pirate explores how stone, water and air have the capacity to dissolve into a total environment where the constituent parts not only become indistinguishable, but actually do merge. Saturated water from crossing the Atlantic Ocean, air blown ashore with the force of a gale, releases a torrent of rain mixed with hail that dashed with unrelenting rage against the hills and rock, leaving a landscape that is perilous to navigate because, quote, often uninterrupted by large pools of water, lakes and lagoons. The landscape has been transformed by a storm. Merton experiences a heightened sense of awareness as he stands alone after the elemental war of the tempest, the salt relish of the drift beating against his cheek to produce the frisson of realisation that, quote, the spray of the more distant ocean, sorry, I've got a slide here, the spray of the more distant ocean, disturbed to frenzy by the storm, was mixed with that of inland lakes and streams. By modern standards, this lesson in meteorology and hydrology is actually fairly elementary. But in a story published in 1821, for a reading public who for the most part would not have visited the northern archipelago or certainly not sailed its seas, it dramatises a strange environment in ways that refuse the resolution of familiarisation. And I want to say something here because we live in a period when the climate change is causing increasing instances of extreme weather around the world. And here we have, in this novel from 1821, a description by Scott of what happens when you get extreme weather conditions, to the distinctions between land and sea. Those distinctions suddenly become completely disrupted. And the land itself, salt water becomes an inland form of water, and the air is saturated with water from the sea. It seems to me that Scott almost understood the kind of conditions that would follow the sort of climate emergency that we're facing in our own time, and that's remarkable. But to conclude, I hope my lecture has both entertained you this evening and helped to show how varied and important was Scott's environmental writing. His version of romantic melancholy, a familiar romantic trope, found expression in a sense of agonised sympathy for what had been lost through changes in land use, mostly through political and cultural culpability in the degradation or destruction of people and the land on which they lived. In the traces that remain in fragments, whether those fragments be ballads, buildings, forests, heather moors, he in turn uncovers a powerful environmental history that long predates the nation he knew, but continued to shape and goes on continuing to shape Scotland's physical and cultural character. Yet his explorations through storytelling of cruelty, hardship and conflict take place alongside a naturalisation of the importance to the imagination of joy and exhilaration. Scott's exhortation of what he believed to be a fundamental need for understanding and unity is never reducible to mere personal, political or cultural fictions. Walter Scott and the Greening of Scotland was written to raise awareness of how the sense of belonging for which Scott has long been known was vibrantly and marvellously ecological. And with that, I thank you very much for coming along this evening.
For me, I felt a truly compelling case of Scott as an environmental writer, and certainly a lot of food for thought for returning to Scott's works, or indeed taking a walk in the woodlands at Abbotsford as well. I'm sure there will be many questions, and so I'd like to invite one of our audience to put any questions to our speaker.
Doesn't matter, take time to think about it. Yes.
Knowledge range.
We have a question.
I was going to ask, so one of the wonderful quotations that you drew from Scott's works, I think it's earlier in your talk, he's looking at the hillside and he's remembering it as having been shaded with trees.
Yes.
Obviously, shading implies a kind of mingling of the natural and the picturesque, or the idea of the drawing. And I just wondered if you could say a bit more about the intersection of the kind of aesthetic value of landscape and then the ecological one. Are these aligned? Are they in conflict? And Scott, how does that work out?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to do that. So I'll go back over where I can speak and people can hear me. So the question is that Scott, I mentioned that Scott wrote about changes in woodland in the landscape and how he talked about the shade that trees provided. And the question is, could I say a little bit more about that? I'm very pleased to do so. One of the things that Scott was very concerned about was the change in the way trees were being planted due to the agricultural revolution, due to the increase in sheep farming. And one of the things I did for the book was actually to read lots of treatises on sheep farming that recommended how trees could be planted to maximise the benefit of shade to sheep, and where they should be planted, what kind of trees should be planted. Scott described at one point that they looked like a sticking plaster on a hillside, and I didn't know they actually had sticking plasters at that time, but they obviously had some form of them. So what he felt was that the trees that were being planted were not being planted in a way that gave consideration, A, to their natural, where they would naturally grow, because many of these trees were sort of growing out of place with where they would normally be growing, but also aesthetically the wrong place. So they created the shade in the wrong ways if you want to take a picturesque view of the landscape. And if we think about the picturesque in terms of art history, and it's an environment where you have kind of the framing of the side of the way that you look at an environment, and then there are bands of light and shade that intersect, and the eye is drawn through those bands of light and shade from the foreground into a distance. And Scott really felt that the planting of trees strategically, according to manuals for sheep farming, was such that it was completely disrupting any opportunity for people to actually look at the landscape in that way. So it changed the way that, if you like, the bands of light and shade that would be part of a painterly picturesque worked. He was also very concerned, I mean, Scott said that he couldn't do the picturesque in painting. He was more a man of the picturesque in action. And the analogy he used was standing on the battlements of Stirling Castle and looking at the field of Bannockburn, and that is a picturesque view. But Scott says no, he would rather be actually on the field and walking around than be looking at it in that way. And he actually really disrupts the way the picturesque view works there, because he's putting himself in the middle distance. He's not taking that distanced view that you would normally with a picturesque perspective on landscape. And in my book, and I think I talked about this last time I came to the Edinburgh World of Scott Club, so I didn't want to repeat it tonight, there's an episode in Waverley where Flora McIver is on a pine tree bridge over a chasm, and Edward Waverley is down below, and he looks at her, and he's so worried that she might fall from the bridge that he swoons and faints. But what Scott does in the way that he writes that episode is basically to say that Flora is actually part of that environment, and she is in the middle of it. Again, it's that instance of being in the middle of the picturesque and being much more assured with where you are. But that is the environmental view, and he certainly understands the more painterly way that people expected a landscape to look. Does that help answer your question?
No, it's really interesting.
There's more about it in the book if you want to read that. But yeah, so really important actually, because the picturesque is one of the predominant ways, as you know, of actually viewing landscapes and expecting, knowing how to expect how they would look. Yes. I'll come over because you don't have a microphone and I do.
Well, one of the things that relates back to that question
Yes.
is the effect of weather, light and shade, sound on the sort of supernatural sensibility, and again, for people who are in a situation like the father and son mentioned.
In the ballad, in the Earl King
yeah.
ballad. Yes, I'd be very pleased to answer that. Do you want to say a bit more, or do you want me to just answer? Yeah, okay, thank you. So thank you for that question. The question is that I mentioned, it's following on from the interest in light and shade. I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture Scott's version of Goethe's ballad, The Earl King, where a father and son ride through woodland. That particular ballad, I mean, it has light and shade in terms of the trees, and they're actually the part of that. They're riding at night, and there's a moon, and there are patches, there are moments when it's dark. So that becomes, I mean, it's more sublime, I think, than picturesque, The Earl King as a ballad. It's much more about terror and fear than, and there's not much safety in it, actually. So with the picturesque, the idea is, you know, that fear, that sort of terror element is always sufficiently distanced and sufficiently enclosed by patches of light and things that you can see properly that it's not horrifying. But in the case of the Earl King, it's probably more of a sublime environment. But I would like to draw attention to something on the matter of light and shade there, and that is the sounds that the father and the son hear, which I mentioned in my lecture. They're very different in terms of timbre, they're very different in terms of audibility. So the father hears the wild blast roaring through the trees, and that's almost like something you can see with a light on it. It's like something that is very evident, he can hear it, there's a storm. But what the son hears is something that is much more discreet and much more troubling, because it's quiet, it's hushed. And that is what exists in the shadows, that's what exists in the shade. And of course, if you know the ballad, that is it's the voice of death that is carrying the child off. And the father doesn't actually hear that. So does that sort of answer your question? That there is an oral light and shade as well as a visual light and shade. And I'm sure that if I thought about it, I could actually come up with numerous instances of where Scott actually does that. He does it all the time. That's that kind of thing all the time. Very interested in sound, and that's something I want to take forward with some other writing. Actually, soundscapes. So Penny, yeah.
So thank you so much. Wonderful lecture. Lovely pairings between the forestry and the ocean. I'd just like to ask about that. So when Scott goes to Orkney and Shetland in reality, in 1814, he's sort of a bit hopeful that agriculture can be, in inverted commas, improved.
Yes.
By 1821, that all seems to have gone. I mean, all improvement schemes in the novel are thwarted, or Scott isn't interested in them anymore. So my question really is, by that time he had a chance to think more about forestry and about trees.
Mm-hmm.
And then he has the opportunity to think about a place which famously doesn't have any trees.
Mm.
So could you talk a little bit about the treelessness of Shetland and Orkney for Scotland?
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that, Penny. Thank you. So Penny's question is about the treelessness of the environment in Orkney and Shetland and Scott's actual visit there. What did he actually make of these islands when he's so fascinated by trees and there are no trees there of any consequence? And what happened to the hopefulness that there would be some change in the way that agriculture was conducted, some hope of agricultural improvement, which he did write about. He thought that Shetland and Orkney could improve their means of agriculture, and yet any idea that that would happen actually kind of went away somewhat. It's interesting that in the monastery, where he goes into a disquisition on Runrig farming and on townships, he uses the example of Shetland and Orkney as places where that still exists. So he's actually he's thinking about them as somewhere that is still in the agricultural past, because in his note to the monastery he talks about how you can still see the remains of that kind of farming in the border, but it's gone. It's long since been superseded by something else. I mentioned his description of Hoy, where he talks about the scrubby, stunted shrubs that grow there, and that fascination with a place where there are trees growing, but they're not growing in the way that he would know trees to grow on the mainland. He's kind of interested in that kind of environment in a number of places in his writing. So in The Legend of the Wars of Montrose, he writes about bog pine woodland, for example, in which the trees tend to be very stunted. And I was really pleased last year on a trip into the Cairngorms to actually see some bog pine woodland. And it was exactly as Scott describes it. I knew what it was the moment I saw it in part of the old growth forest, and very fascinating. So he's interested in places where trees don't grow as you would expect them. But on the mainland, the main islands in Shetland and Orkney, Scott he was an agricultural improver in many ways, but of course he was always interested in agricultural improvement alongside a sympathy for the landscape in which you were working. But I think the fact that he introduces that argument over whether there really is a need to improve the agriculture of the islands when young men are more needed in the fishing industry, probably provides the answer to that. He also saw the fishing industry for Scotland as something that was a face of the future. It was something that people needed to be thinking about and developing, and that there was more opportunity for those young people to work in the fishing industry than on land. I mean, it's an ongoing issue with islands, isn't it? Whether people work at sea or whether they work on the land. I hope that kind of answers your question a little bit. I mean, he's certainly very interested in the fact there are not many trees, and what there are are stunted. But it's also very interesting that those are very ancient trees as well. So he associates the growth that is there with a kind of ancient society. It's almost as if that society is very trapped physically in the past, as well as in terms of its cultural habits. Yes, Peter.
Thank you, Susan. That was a marvellously full and rich statement you gave us. I really did appreciate it. I was fascinated by the Malachi Malagrove and the tree there. You said the English tree,
yes,
which provides protection, but it doesn't extend as far as Scotland. Did I read that correctly?
It's a wonderful analogy. Yeah.
Is it an oak? By the way, it is an oak.
Yes.
And it's a very strong metaphor of English tourism, isn't it?
Yes.
With Dr. Johnson, Burke, and you mentioned it. Is there something else involved in that statement, that somehow the English Tory metaphor of the protecting oak tree through generations doesn't quite apply to the Scottish situation, which might be more variegated, for instance?
I'm really glad you've asked that question, so I'll answer that.
Yeah.
I'll go back to the microphone so people can hear. So Peter's question was about the metaphor of the tree in the letters of Malachi Malagratha, the English oak tree in particular, that only extends as far as the Scottish border, and that it's very symbolic for Scott of England, the oak tree for the Bank of England, and for England as a nation. It's culturally very symbolic of Englishness. And what was he doing there by using that metaphor of the oak? Scott was very interested in planting oaks. He planted lots of oak trees himself, and the oak was a tree that was native to Scotland. But for Scott, the Scots Pine is the tree that is most symbolic of Scottishness. And he actually describes the Scots Pine in terms of its symbolism of Scottishness. This is in the essay that I talked about on forestry. That, you know, it's rugged, it's tough, and it has these sort of gnarled and very robust limbs. It's quite a tree of very different appearance from the oak tree. The metaphor, it's fascinated me that he's thinking through trees as a means of talking about what is appropriate by way of almost a cultural invasion of the nation by the Bank of England. So the oak tree, the idea that it can't flourish any further than the boundary with Scotland and England, unless it is permitted to do so by the Scots, is what I find very, very fascinating, actually. That no, it's something that in order to continue to expand, it would have to be allowed to do so, and he doesn't want it to be allowed to do so. Does that help somewhat? So it's very much that opposition between the Scots Pine as the emblem of Scotland and the oak.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Say more about drainage.
Yes.
You may know that drainage was an early common interest between Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII. They bonded over drainage.
Over drainage, yes. I'd be very pleased to, yeah. Did you want to ask a little bit more about that? Or?
Well, drainage, reclaiming land.
Yes, yeah.
And then what you use the land for.
Yes.
And not leaving the land in its natural state, which is waterlogged. Perhaps not appreciating the nature of boggy ground and its vegetation.
Yes. I'd be very happy to talk about that, so I'll go to the microphone. The question is, can I say a little bit more about drainage? I mentioned the drainage of peat bogs, I think twice in my lecture. And how Scott viewed this, the movement towards increased drainage of land, and the idea that bogland was perhaps not very useful and not very valuable. Scott was certainly involved in some drainage of land around Abbotsford, and he was very interested in what was being found generally inland that was being drained around the nation. So all sorts of things were being found, so he's very interested in things that get pulled out of peat bogs. But he was also very concerned about the loss of particular kinds of habitat culturally and in terms of ecologies. I'm going to just talk about the cultural side of that first. If we go back to minstrelsy of the Scottish border, a lot of the border ballads, certainly those set in the higher areas of the borders, have morasses in them. And the morasses are very important to the story. So you'll have a reaver ballad where reavers are pursued through boggy morasses and people can't follow them, or villains get trapped in morasses and come to sticky, very literally sticky ends in them. And also some of the novels as well. The Monastery has an episode where the morasses in the borders are really important. So culturally speaking, morasses and bogland, undrained, are really important to Scott because they are the stuff of storytelling. And there's nothing Scott likes more than old storytelling that he can get his hands on. And then, of course, he'll add notes saying, that these morasses don't exist anymore if they don't exist anymore. So culturally, the morass and the bog is a very interesting place. Certainly the bog pine woodland that I mentioned in A Legend of the Wars of Montrose is a very interesting place for Scott, because it's a place where the children of the mist retreat. They're outlaws, they can be shot on sight like wolves. They're actually not, they're brought in and imprisoned and make eloquent speeches about how they have been dehumanised and called wolves. But the bog pine woodland is very essential to that story in all sorts of ways. And had it not been there and had that landscape not exist, Scott couldn't have told the stories that he did. But a lot of it was gone by the time that he was writing. I think you mentioned Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII. I didn't know about that. Thank you. I shall have to find out more about that. And one of the good things about giving a lecture of this kind is, you go away having learned lots, because there are people who know things that you just not come across. But yeah, I mean, the thing about drainage is that it was altering the landscape, and it was what was done with it afterwards that concerned Scott quite a lot. So if a wetland meadow was drained, as indeed it was, just along from Abbotsford and Ashestiel, by his cousin, and Scott wrote about this meadow, and he remembered the meadow with all of the wildflowers that grew in it. And it had been drained and it had been planted with 2 species of imported grass from Sweden. And all of not only had the beauty of it been gone, had been taken away, but also all of the stories that those plants told, because flowers are also, wildflowers are invested with stories by Scott. Different kinds of flower commemorate different kinds of thing. And they also represent a diverse history of the nation. And diversity is something Scott's very interested in. He wants unity in diversity, not homogeneity. Scott wasn't somebody who was interested in things being the same. He wanted lots of difference, but those things to work together and to work harmoniously. What I would like to say is that he had no conception whatsoever of a carbon sink. So he had no idea that draining bogland was actually doing something that would contribute negatively to the climate from the time he was living until the period where we are now, where we know that immense damage was done by the drainage of peat bogs. Pity he didn't know that, because so much of what he writes actually does begin to anticipate the problems that we see, like that extreme weather episode that I talked about. Now, what happens if, suddenly the weather is so violent that a place is changed beyond the way that we know it? But with bog drainage, he didn't do that so much. And I'm just trying to think. Frederick Albritton-Johnson writes in his book Enlightenment's Frontier about an estate in Scotland where there was massive drainage, and somebody can probably tell me which estate that is. I'm not able to come up with it off the cuff here, but it's in Johnson's book Enlightenment's Frontier. There's a case study of an estate where substantial drainage was carried out. Does that help? Does that answer your question a bit? Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Are there any final questions, or Susan, you've already answered those so wonderfully and richly for us, so thank you ever so much. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Robert Irvin to give the vote of thanks.
If I can just say, it was Blair Adam was the estate, sorry.
It's my great honour to move a vote of thanks on behalf of both Walter Scott Club of Edinburgh, but also the University of Edinburgh, to Professor Oliver for her wonderful talk this evening. I was especially struck by what she was saying about trees and her fascinating analysis of the role of trees in Scott, both as matter and as metaphor. It's a confusion you sometimes come across in some people who confuse the environment with scenery. It's not the same thing, and I don't think Scott ever confused those two. For Scott, the landscape is never just scenery, it is always also environment. It is the product of history, and the absence of trees, for example, from the Highland or the Borders hills is as much an effect of history as the comparative absence of people from those same landscapes. Professor Oliver mentioned the plight of the capercaillie, cause close to my own heart. A bird now so rare in Scotland that it has to remain as much a creature of, for most people it has to remain as much a creature of the imagination as the kraken lurking in its caves under the northern deeps. How do we start to fix that situation? Well, by connecting up the fragments. We can begin by connecting up the fragments of the old Caledonian Scots pine forest that survived. And I think what we heard from Professor Oliver tonight was a wonderful connecting up of those points in Scott where he addresses environmental issues, a connecting up of the forests in Scott with the issues that we're all facing in our present day. And by doing this in her book and in her talk this evening, Professor Oliver is making Scots writing available to us all, I think, as a resource which we can use in facing the problems of the coming difficult years. So on that perhaps slightly pessimistic, I'd like to move a vote of thanks for Professor Oliver on behalf of the Walter Scott Club and Edinburgh University.
Susan Oliver, well, thank you properly again at the very end there. But just before we part ways, we need not. There is indeed refreshments immediately after this, so do stay and join us for those if you can do so. Just a reminder for folk from the Edinburgh Walter Scott Club, we do have another event this year on the 17th of November, where Ian Gordon-Brown will be speaking to us about, let me get this right, the Greek blockhead, Walter Scott, Greek, Greece and the Greeks. Is that correct?
It's a bit over Greek, but that's pretty well it, yes.
So do join us again for that, again, if you're interested and able to do so. So without any further ado, just the very final matter of business is to say a very heartfelt thanks to you, Susan, for such a wonderful talk this evening.
Thank you again. I'm deeply honoured to be here this evening.